Good morning. It falls to me, in the absence of our director, who is at this moment somewhere between London and New York, to welcome you all and to thank Marina Lattery for imagining and instigating this symposium on writing and critical thinking in architecture. Whilst I clearly cannot supply Brett's boyish good looks or indeed his American accent or his stature in any sense, I can offer a few words on his behalf. The AA is a school, amongst many others, that endeavours to value the precarious nature of making things. At its best, it can create elbow room for the unmeasurable aspects of education, all that is ephemeral and seemingly unuseful, the very things that benchmarks and percentages and predetermined outcomes seek to suffocate. At the AA, an institution full of life and opinions, we continually face the conundrum of measurability. How is it that in the making of both architecture and writing and all that lies between, we can recognise something we have never seen before and know it to be right? How, as a school, do we acknowledge the exceptional when, by its very definition, it rejects or redefines the very structure on which it was based? If, as Sontag says in her jottings, there are many things in the world that have not been named, and many things that, even if they have been named, have never been described, then it is these unnamed spaces, these sensibilities in writing and in architecture, that we as a school seek to draw forth. All of us here involved in making things recognise the importance of experimentation, of exploration, of the what-ifs that demand a temporal sanctuary in which to risk and to mistake. Yet we live in a post-Fordist environment of instabilities and uncertainties, and where we can reach every point in the world and where we can be reached from every point in the world. Our attention is continually under siege. How and where do we now find a place to doubt, to meditate, to quietly obsess on the blankness of a wall, or the near invisibility of Reinhardt's blacks, or the construction of absence in Tristram Shandy? At the AA, where the domestic and in some ways very introverted spaces of a Georgian home are collapsed with the extrovert and very public programmes of a school, it seems that there is a misfit, or that this misfit or irreverence of use affords us an intellectual and spatial purgatory. This is a place, a site, where a symposium could be called a salon, where attendees and speakers are sympotes or fellow drinkers, and where architecture and writing could be considered, for a short time only, one discipline, and where we can sit together in a drawing room such as this and simply talk.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for your stimulating introduction. And this is exactly the reason we are here, to talk and to talk about writing. And I think the aim of the day was to gather people who are involved with writing, with architecture in different ways, in different forms, and somehow share our interest. I would like to welcome all of you. I would like to welcome the audience on behalf of the AA, and I would like also to welcome all the speakers who came from many different places to be here with us today. Mario Carpa, Yves Lomax, Nasrin Sarahi, Jane Randall, Giovanna Borassi, and Hans Meyer. And I really look forward to the the day, and I'm sure that it will be a very productive and also enjoyable day for all of us. The aim, I would like, my talk will be more an introductory talk to the day, to different issues we've been exploring here, we've been addressing here in the school. And I would like to outline and locate these issues, to put them forward, and then let the speakers expand on them. The aim of the event was, the function of the event within the school somehow is twofold. The one is that we wanted to increase the awareness of writing, of the central role of writing in architecture, and also writing not as something detached or external to design or something external to practice, but actually writing as integral part to the architectural project. And I would say, I would go even further, and I would suggest writing itself as project. And that actually is, that's why I named my talk as writing as architecture, and not architecture as writing, which used to be the case 20 years ago. And also the second part of that event, or the second motive for this event, was a reformulation and redevelopment of our graduate course in history and critical thinking, where writing has now become a very central part of the course. So we address writing not only as another tool instead of designing writing, but as an object of study. So we study and investigate writing in its different forms. And also we address, or we think of writing as another form of engagement with practice. And in this sense, writing is more of a critical, becomes part of a critical practice and becomes a critical means of thinking, rather something which comes to complement what we design or explain. So writing, I'll put it forward here as both a pedagogical and a critical agenda. Now, following on this, I would like just to make 2 points. The one is that the one has to do with the multiple functions which, in my view, are contained in the term writing. The multiple functions and the multiple forms of writing. And in one way, I see part of our task today to constitute an often problematic alignment of these different functions and forms. The second point, which I would also pose as a question, as a problem, is that what are we being told when it is said that there's no longer any reality, that only images? So I think it's something that will be addressed explicitly by some of our speakers. By just departing from that, a quite recent claim, I would like to say that somehow to relocate, to rethink, to redefine writing. So departing from that, I would like to say that writing is not only to designate the physical gestures of literal pictographic or ideographic inscription, but also the totality of what makes that inscription possible. So in one way, writing is also to designate what gives rise to an inscription and what distributes this inscription in space. So writing is not only in its becoming, its act, but also in its space, in its disposition, how it's being disposed, and what I would literally call is geography. So in this sense, in my view, there is a regime of relations between the function of signification, the power of signification, and the visibility. And when I say here visibility, I don't mean it only in the terms of an image, but as something that rather presents a relationship between what can be said and what can be seen, between the sayable and the visible. A relationship which plays on both the analogy between them, between the sayable and the visible, and also the dissemblance between them. The word deploys a visibility and makes something visible which is not yet present, which is not yet seen. So in this sense, words and writing are redistributing the relations between, as I said, the visible and the sayable, between the visible and the invisible. So writing, for me, it's not only engaged in the construction of a theoretical statement, in the construction of the text, but in this sense, it is also involved in the practices and techniques of architecture. And actually, writing itself is a technique by means of which visual and textual elements are interlaced with one another and thereby constitute an aesthetic regime, which is at once visual, graphic, and textual. So there are two implications following this. The one is that this combination of elements, graphic elements, visual, and textual, which are being combined in accordance with certain rules, introduce and establish a community between forms of writing and ways of thinking architecture, between forms of writing and how they correspond to ways we think and we practice. And also, on the other hand, if we talk about an aesthetic regime, they establish a relationship between the intelligence that produced these combinations of elements and the sensibilities which are called upon to experience the pleasure of them. And just in order to illustrate that, I don't have images. I'll just talk very, very briefly about two examples in of architectural writing or in the history of our discipline, of our profession, which are very well-known moments, very well-known episodes, so I don't need images to illustrate or inform about. The one is when we have the first texts in architecture, the Renaissance Trattato, treatise, and the other is the other form of writing which I referred to just to support and reinforce what I just said is the manifesto as a form of writing that corresponds to ideas of design and practices of design of the early 20th century. As you all know, the Trattato, the treatise, is not but a kind, or was a kind of encyclopedia, a textbook. It was an assemblage of words and images, which of course was made possible by the mechanical presses and the new procedure of lithography, and Mario Carpo has extensively written on that. I don't have to summarize on his behalf. And this kind of assembling of words and images allowed an encyclopedia of a shared human inheritance in which remote forms could now become bodies of knowledge and be popularized, be accessed as such. So, as you all know, in the famous De Edificatoria by Alberti, the art of building, Alberti, it's not that it begins by praising the knowledge of the ancients, but he's using that as a knowledge base upon which to assemble new constructs. So in one way here, the past is being stripped of its absolute authority and is being reproduced or is being conceived as elements of an encyclopedia, of a thesaurus that can be recombined to create modern structures, modern bodies of knowledge. And also to offer a new system of values for designing the new with precedence. That means, apart from that, which is, I think, a quite well-known fact, apart from that, I would say that means that a collective imagery is being created through the textbook, through the document. Because it is exactly that document, that text, the putting together of words and images, the putting together of elements of the past, which constructs the figure of a common history. And thereby defining, in many respects, the criterion of the modernity of the works, of the new. So history here, as recorded, as documented, as reassembled, becomes the thread and a common measurement, which not only governs the distance between the past and the now, the moment, but what is more important for me, that makes possible a thinking in common. So in one way, in the present, and therefore creates a communal space. And that's where I see another function of writing in architecture. So it's the power of singularity of the image, and by image I mean both the textual and the graphic, which combines with the educational value of the document, bearing the traces of history. So the text here, which is a project, is but a demonstration, becomes a demonstration of this act of invention, the act of synthesis. In other words, what Alberti would call consinitas, which is, but it's not but a mental form, and it also comes from the tradition of rhetorics, which means the bringing together of heterogeneous elements into a harmonious whole, into a composite whole. And of course, this act of invention, this act of synthesis, takes place not only in the text, not only the document, but also in the site, in the drawing, in the actual site, in the building, in the city. So that's how I see the thread and the common measurement operating through these different levels of the practice of architecture. So in this term, writing, it is a technique, a means to give form, to define not only a contour, to define not only a boundary, but also to communicate that definition, to communicate that boundary, to make it legible. So in one way, it is a description, but also a declaration. And that's, as I said, is where I see the public or the civic function in these terms of writing. To construct, codify a knowledge of the world, and by doing that, it communicates a certain idea of the social, a certain idea of, in the terms of Alberti, of citizenship. Of course, when we move a little bit forward to the early 20th century, and the manifesto, which was also very common use, a common tool, a means to communicate ideas and practice of design, what is to be communicated, what is to be seen, what is to be said is very different, and of course that also corresponds or reflects on the form of writing. So here, the historical perspective shifts completely from a pure condition of knowledge. And in one way, in many ways, the design and the practice and the writing concern the search for the laws of motion of history. And so that the artist, the architect, the author can deduce from these laws a future which they can then influence and shape. So in one way, the language here, the text here, the form, bears within itself the necessity of critique, and the project registers a different relationship between making and knowledge. So it's not the actual making which is subordinated to a pure theoretical knowledge, to some theoretical premises, but it's knowledge which is to be obtained through the actual making of the document, the actual making of the drawing of the building. And of course, it's that making, this actual making, which also gives a continuing validity to the past. And that not only gives another meaning of another sense of modernity, but also establishes the importance of the position from which one can apprehend that moment and then form a judgment on the past, on the present, from a contemporary perspective. So here writing has already become a critical practice. And there is a paradoxical intertwining of modes of imagery and critical discourse. And I'll take this as an invitation to reformulate the questions and to ask what would be a thinking in common or a communal space today with respect to what idea of architecture, with respect to what idea of history. And of course, here I would just introduce again the much abused and the much kind of, at the same time, attacked term of the critical and criticism. Because obviously, the critical cannot operate in the same way today, in a normative way, can no longer compare what is with what it should be, or it should have been, or it ought to be. But I think we should still pose the question of what it is, what it has been done, in which ways a practice is being attuned to a way of seeing and falls within a way of thinking. In order, again, to rearrange, if you want, the relationship between the seeable and the visible, in order to indicate possible communal spaces in which debate can take place, in which forms of engagement with the common can develop. Of course, it seems that very difficult today, where we have a global intelligence pervading everything, and many elements which cannot perhaps be composed together. And of course, history has often become a locus of conflict, and we are often trapped in a kind of uncertainty of boundaries. But nevertheless, I would still put forward that question, how we can define or provide a common measurement through the practice, including writing. The practice as I said, a means of critical thinking, how we can construct a new visibility and a new relation between a practice and this new regime of visibility. Thank you. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Jane Rendell, who is a professor and vice dean of research at the Bartlett School of Architecture. Jane recently published a book which is called entitled Sight Writing, and that's also the title of her talk today. She has published extensively on issues of writing and art and architecture. Apart from such writing, she published Art and Architecture, The Pursuit of Pleasure, and Critical Architecture, Spatial Imagination, The Unknown City, Intersections, Gender, Space, and Architecture, and Strangely Familiar. And she has given many talks in art galleries and institutions, and has collaborated with many artists. So please welcome Jen Randall. And then we'll move on to the third speaker of the morning, Mario Carpo. And at the end, we all sit at the table and receive your questions and have a discussion. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thanks Marina for a really thought-provoking introduction. I think there's some fantastic issues and questions that you've raised there that I would, think would be incredibly important to address today. I was particularly interested in what you were saying about what it's possible to say and what it's possible to see, and also the idea of the kind of civic function of writing that I think is really very interesting. What I'd like to do today is present two different sight writings. One from about 2002 called Confessional Construction, and another much more recent project called MORN that I'm working on at the moment. And the sort of thematic that I want to track between those two readings is the issue of transitional space. And I'll explain how those two things work, how the two readings work through that theme as I go. So without sort of further introduction, I want to just go straight to the writing itself and present a reading, and then I'll explain a little bit more of the background behind the piece of writing afterwards. At the Book Art Bookshop in London, on the corner of Charles Street and Pitfield Street, Bridget McClear was invited to curate one of the outside walls. She asked me to write a page that would be pasted to the wall for a month. McClear's interest was in the physical construction of the text and the ways in which I might explore my position within the space of the writing. How would the public placing of a page on a wall influence what and how I might write? Anticipating those public passers-by who might come across the text and read in distraction, rather than choose to immerse themselves in the pages of a book in a private, quiet place, a new way of working emerged that changed the manner in which I would normally have considered the layout of the text on the page and my place within it. A main statement, an autobiographical detail, perhaps a confessional, was interwoven with more critical reflections upon what it means to confess. I placed the footnotes down the side of the page, numbered from the bottom to the top, to read upwards as one builds a wall. They contain specifications by an architect friend, Deborah Miller, concerning the detailing of walls and openings. These careful instructions for physically constructing the boundary between inside and outside, precisely the site in which this page was located, touched upon my own developing interest in the confession as a construction rather than a revelation of the self. When I read out my confessional construction, pasted to the wall of the Book Art Bookshop, as one would read a page from left to right, from top to bottom, I transform my relation to the page and its three voices. What has been created through this process, by accident it seems, are a series of blockages which obstruct the smooth flow of an autobiographical confession. And I'm going to read that out now. So what it is a reading, that the text is constructed of three different voices, a sort of autobiographical narrative, a more psychoanalytic reflection and specification as footnotes. And this is a reading that actually just works as you would read a page from left to right. In 1989, on the way to Austin, Texas, face work, protect against damage and disfigurement, particularly ereses of openings and corners. I've always considered autobiographical writing to be a confessional, part of a process of revelation, one that uncovers the truth beneath. But recently 14, to Santiago Atitlan, Guatemala, I met a Chicano. Basic workmanship, store bricks, blocks in stable stacks clear of the ground, protect from inclement weather and keep clean and dry. I've come to realise that a confessing is not a revealing, but a constructing of ourselves too. Writing about myself is a making of myself 3, although 13. Artist who gave me a book, the polyethylene damp-proof course. Joint sheets with continuous strips of mastic between 150mm overlaps and seal with tape along the edge of the upper sheet, leaving no gaps. Ensure that sheets are clean and dry at the time of jointing. The writing confesses to be a window or an opening to a, if sheets cannot be kept dry, double welted joins may be used, taped to hold in position prior to laying concrete. Interior 4, it might be better described as a mask 5 or a wall 6, a boundary 12. Passionate nomad. The book was the lay neatly and tuck well in angles to prevent bridging. Form folded welts at corners in upstands between myself and another. 7, as such, it is a form of psychic architecture. 11, Diary of Isabel Eberhardt, a young second-hand London stock facing brickwork. Bricks, second-hand London stock bricks to match existing, free from deleterious materials such as mortar, plaster, paint, bituminous materials, and organic growths. Sometimes I draw others into my stories, my father, my mother, even my lover. 8, sometimes it was without their consent. 9, they're an integral part of. 10, alterations, extensions, except where a straight vertical joint is specified, new existing facework in the same plane to be tooth bonded together at every course to give continuous appearance. Woman from an affluent French family, where new lintels or walling are to support existing structure, completely fill top joint with semi-dry mortar, hard-packed and well-rammed to ensure full load transfer after removal of temporary supports. My confessional construction, 10, if they are the building materials, then who is 9, the architect? Alterations, extensions, arrange brick courses to line up with existing work, brick to block, 4 courses high at 8 course centres, brick to block to brick, or block to block, every who spent the latter part of her short alternative block course, bond new walling into pockets with all voids filled solid. 8, my love of writing is generated through a desire for encounters. I often tell stories about myself to make a place to meet my reader. Fire stopping, fill joints across joint ends, built into cavity walls with mortar to seal cavities from interior of building, ensure a tight fit between brick block and cavity barriers to prevent fire and smoke penetration. Life disguised as an Arab man, wander, 7, in telling you about myself, I am revealing aspects of myself, making myself vulnerable, 11, but am I really revealing facework? Keep courses evenly paced, using gauge rods set out carefully to ensure satisfactory junctions and joints with adjoining or built-in elements and components. In the deserts of northern Africa, she died, 6. Is it not that I am showing you my vulnerability, showing you who I am, 12, facework? Select brick blocks with unchipped ereses, cut with a masonry saw where cut edges will be exposed to view. 5, age 28, on 21st October 1904 in a flash flood at Timber Windows, to BS 644, Part 1. Are my stories walls or windows? 13. When no pre-drilled or specified otherwise, position fixings no more than 150 mil from each end of jamb, adjacent to each hanging point of opening lights and at maximum 450 mil centres. 4. And Sephra. Her diary is one of my basic workmanship. Bring both leaves of cavity walls to the same level at every course containing rigid ties, every third course for double triangle butterflies ties, courses in which lintels are to be bedded. What does psychoanalysis say about boundaries? What do walls say about do not carry up any one leaf more than 1.5 metres in one day unless permitted to by the CA? Self-Protection 3, favourite books. I too have had addictive, basic workmanship. Build walls in stretching half-lap bond when not specified otherwards. Are architectural and psychic elements, processes and structures analogous? 14.2, relationships. All specifications from Deborah Miller, architect. On the corner of Charles Street and Pitfield Street, she found a bookshop, one that she'd not noticed before. She walked in. On the left-hand wall, lying on the floor, quite close to the wall, she saw a book. When she bent down to pick it up, she saw it was a copy of Sigmund Freud, The Essentials of Psychoanalysis. She turned to page 117. Crouching there, close to the floor, head almost touching the wall, she started to read. Our hypothesis is that in our mental apparatus there are two thought-constructing agencies. She read for 26 seconds. So that piece of writing is taken from my recent book, Sight Writing, which is an attempt to provide a form of what I'm calling situated criticism. It's an interdisciplinary project. It works across art and architecture, feminism, criticism, psychoanalysis, and autobiography. In many ways, it's a continuation of a search which has been going for me for a long time to try and articulate the position of the writing subject and her objects of study and subject matter, intellectually, creatively, critically, and emotionally. And although I would describe it still as a feminist and a spatial work, it's a very long way from my first book, The Pursuit of Pleasure, which was a feminist and Marxist critique of rambling, a gendered spatial practice which mapped the movement of young men through London's clubs, theatres and streets in search of pleasure in 19th century London, and where I was very emphatic in stating my feminist and Marxist aspirations at the outset. In Sight Writing, the boundary between subjects and objects is much more porous, and the arguments are made not really directly, but indirectly through association and implication. The book also marks quite a transition from a previous volume, which I really see Sight Writing as a sequel to Art and Architecture. In Art and Architecture, I examined projects which I called forms of critical spatial practice that were located between art and architecture and critiqued the sites into which they were inserted. But during the processes of researching and writing the book, I realised that the changing position that I was occupying between art, architecture and theory didn't really proceed, but was actually produced my critical attitude. So by the end of Art and Architecture, I actually made the argument that criticism is itself a form of practice. And in my view, it's a form of critical spatial practice. That may not be the same for all critics, but certainly I would argue that criticism is a form of practice. So the interest that I've had in sight writing has been in investigating the relationships between critic, work, and reader. Not just the material sites of production and reception of a work, but those imagined, remembered, and dreamed. Sight writing tries to explore the position of the critic through the sight of writing itself. So there's an interest in the design, or to use Marina's word, the making of writing, let's say. Its composition, its arrangement, and to use devices which I consider to be spatial, such as voice, framing, viewpoint, returning. I think this attitude to writing, which considers it a form of spatial practice, is no doubt influenced by my early training and work as an architectural designer, and I certainly think of writing as a creative response to a brief. And most of the writing in sight writing was produced in response to very particular invitations, either to write or talk about particular pieces of work. Some of those are responses which critique the brief that I've been given in a very architectural manner, critique of the brief. Others are much more intuitive. They're sort of quite emotional, they're dreamy, they're associative, they're meandering, they're out of place in some way. The book was not written all at once. It's not a linear or sequential argument. And in fact, since it's been published, I've had quite a few emails from people who say that they've enjoyed dipping into it, which is nice, because it's kind of how I intended it to be read. So each reader finds their own way through the arrangements. And it's actually the arrangement of the essays within the book and the reworkings of the writings within them in relation to each other that I see as part of an architectural act. And we can maybe debate whether writing can be architectural or not. I would argue that it can be. Not in the same way as an architect builds a building, but it can certainly draw on architectural mechanisms. And arrangement, spatial arrangement, would be one of those things. The book is set within an interdisciplinary framework. Very particularly, what I'm trying to do is explore how particular spatial concepts can offer different kinds of processes and subjects for criticism. So my particular spatial concepts are psychoanalytic configurations that I've taken from readings of Freud, and also developments of his work by two French psychoanalysts, André Green and Jean Laplanche. And I actually decided to use the psychic configurations to structure the book. And I'm not going to go through that in great detail, but just to give you a sense of it. So the first one that I read, the confessional construction, is taken from the first configuration, triangular structures with variable thirds, and I'll come back and say a little bit about that in a minute. The second configuration, to and fro, takes up some of Freud's writing on frontier creatures, or how he sees the relation between ego, superego, and id, and the to and fro between conscious and unconscious. The third configuration is called a rearrangement, and looks at Freud's distinctions between how the conscious mind works through words and how the unconscious works through what he calls thing presentations. Which is perhaps another way of thinking about what can be seen and what can be said. I think that could be a way of thinking about it. The fourth one, that which keeps coming back, uses the configuration of déjà vu, the idea that something you see will return. And the final one is decentering and recentering, which actually comes from the work of Jean Laplanche, but it tries to explore how in criticism one's constantly moving between trying to centre the work in relation to one's kind of subject position, to order the work in relation to one's own position as a critic, and also then how the work operates as a kind of enigma, a mystery that unsettles the critic and restructures the critic according to the work. So there's a constant oscillation in play. In each of the configurations, what I'm trying to do is both look at works that actually engage with some of the key thematics of the principle, but what I'm also trying to do, which makes the book a lot more experimental than anything I've done before, is I'm actually trying to perform the configuration in written form. So, for example, in the first one, I'm trying to write something that is a triangular structure with variable thirds. In the fourth one, for example, I'm trying to produce a writing which is a form of déjà vu, where some things you see will come back. And that's, for me, been the most exciting part. Whether it works, I don't know. That depends on what readers think. But for me, that's been the challenge, and that's what feels to me much more like the act of design than perhaps previous work where I've done more conventional history and theory and criticism. So just to explain that a little bit further, in configuration 1, triangular structures with variable thirds, the particular triadic structure that I'm looking at is the psychoanalytic setting. And I'm looking at that in order to think about shifting psychic vantage points adopted by the subject in relation to both others and objects. And therefore the configuration is structured into 3 different voices. Object relations is the sort of key form of psychoanalysis that I've been interested in, which was developed by the independent British analysts and consists of an understanding of unconscious relations that exist between a subject and his or her own objects, particularly coming through the work of Donald Winnicott, who introduced the idea of a transitional object, and this is where I get to the theme of transition, related to but distinct from both the external object, which for the child in the early stages is the mother's breast, and the internal object, which is the internalized, introjected breast. So what Winnicott's interested in is the transitional object, which occupies a place between inner world and exterior world. And André Green, who uses both Freud's and Winnicott's work, considers the analytic setting to be what he calls a homologue for this third element in analysis, the analytic object, which corresponds precisely to Winnicott's definition of the transitional object. which is formed in the analytic relationship between the analyst and the analysand. This is actually an image of a work by Sophie Calle, where she placed her own objects within Freud's consulting rooms. So Green compares the closed space of the consulting room to Winnicott's notion of transitional space, noting it has a specificity of its own, which differs from both inside and outside space. And he understands this as a spatial construction, a generalised triangular structure with a variable third. And for him, this triangular paradigm unites the dream, the maternal caring from the mother, and the prohibition of incest from the father. So it's a more fluid way of thinking about the Oedipus complex. So the triangular structure is actually an Oedipal structure, but not in conventional senses. So what I tried to do within the configuration was look. The first essay actually has three voices: the sort of paternal voice of the architect father telling me how to design when I was a student, the feminist theorist mother, and then my own experience of that. And then a reworking of that essay looks at a piece by Tracy Emin, where she's actually negotiating the relationship between herself and her mother and father through three different sculptures. And then the third element is the one that I read out to you, which again works through three different kinds of architectural voice. I want to move on now and read another sight writing, which is actually part of a new work, which comes out of some material in the sight writing book, but is I'm reworking into something, into a new project. The first outcome, if you like, of this is an essay called MORN, which was published in this rather beautiful book called Towards a Reenchantment, Place in Its Meanings, edited by Gareth Evans and Di Robson, and it's a collection of prose. So I'm just going to read a little bit from that to you. The house is beautiful, a one-storey building with a square plan, born at the birth of modernism in the aftermath of the First World War. It embodies the values of early English modernism, of the arts and crafts movement, truth to materials and honest craftsmanship. From the road it looks a little unloved, in need of some care and attention, and up close it is clearly derelict, almost in ruins. We enter a room with windows at each end. Curtains are falling away from the runners. The fabric has been soaked overnight and is drying in the spring afternoon sunshine. On the windowsill and spilling over onto the floor are piles of old magazines. The pages are stuck together and disintegrate if you try to pull them apart. There are some photographs of buildings. One is particularly damp, the corners are soft, the surface is wrinkled. It shows a tower block just completed, empty and pristine, a moss green utopia, the modernist dream dispersing as it soaks up spring rain. In 2001, curator Jules Wright from the Wapping Project in London invited me to write an essay about artist Alina Brotherus's work, Spring. It was composed of two installations, a video triptych, Rain, the Oak Forest and Flood, in the boiler house, and a backlit image, Untitled, measuring 3 by 8 metres and reflected in the water tank on the roof of Wapping. Untitled showed an illuminated horizon dividing sky from earth, a pale grey sky of Iceland floating above what was once viscous lava, now covered in green moss. In responding to Spring, I found myself returning to scenes, real and imagined, dreamed and remembered, that corresponded with Brotherus's images and supplemented her landscapes with places of my own. The three places I described made spatial, material and visual associations with Brotherus's Spring. In Moss Green, I remembered a derelict house in the Greenbelt, where in Spring we found photographs of a brave new world of modernist high-rise housing. Just after the autumn equinox, just after her death, I dreamt of the shrouded home of my Welsh great-aunt. White linen recalled the presence of life in the form of plants in this dream, while Bittersweet recounted another spring visit, this time to abandoned cork factory in Catalonia, where we found the names of colours scattered abandoned all over the floor: black, white, orange, turquoise, bittersweet. Anticipating the end of winter, spring opened in Wapping just after the autumn equinox in the northern hemisphere. Curatorially, the work faced towards the long decline into winter, the season from which it desired to turn away. Paralleling this juxtaposition which poised spring's hope for winter's retreat right at its early edge, I positioned spring's foregrounding of anticipation as a yearning that looks forward to new life against my own fascination with the backwards gaze of nostalgia. My three texts connected Brotherus's landscapes infused with anticipatory longing to places tinted by nostalgia, constructing a tension between life and death, rejuvenation and decay, a looking forward and a turning backward. My first visit to the house I came to call Moss Green had occurred in the spring of 2001, and for the next decade I was to walk past it several times a year as part of my weekly Sunday walk. Every Sunday, whatever the weather, taking a flask of hot soup to be supped under the dripping branches of winter trees, or a picnic to be eaten in a sunlit meadow, my partner and I make the journey to Waterloo or London Bridge and board a train taking us to the limit of the metropolis, to London's so-called green belt. After about an hour, and more recently, with the collapse of the Sunday rail network, more like 2, and even more recently 7, we disembark the train and walk into the dusk along the paths of the Weald. In our walks out of Sevenoaks, we sometimes take the route down Oak Lane, then Grassy Lane, past Fig Street, and then along Gracious Lane, drawing to a halt at the fork in the road where Moss Green is situated. When we first saw the house, we were entirely enchanted with the way of life it represented, as well as the arresting beauty of its slow yet gentle decay. The house was single-storey, of brick and timber construction, placed at the top of a scarp slope, with its porch looking out over southern England, under which 2 benches faced one another. The interior was full of exquisite touches. A perfectly placed built-in cupboard, a carefully detailed windowsill and frame, a thoughtful light switch, a door handle that fitted like a glove. It was hovering at that point where the decay was still able to provide an atmosphere of charm, and where the thought of collapse could be held off, and where it was possible to imagine oneself into the house, repairing the woodwork and occupying the rooms. We guessed it had probably been built after the First World War, perhaps as a part of a programme called Homes Fit for Heroes, which allowed returning and often traumatised soldiers to readjust to civilian life in the comfort of a simple domestic setting with space for gardening and growing food. But over the years, the house has increasingly fallen into disrepair, and our spirits now sink each time we see it. When its slate roof was removed 3 years ago, the rot really set in, and as a structure, it's now barely stable. As it slipped past the threshold of being savable, we have surrendered our dream of living there ourselves in a modest rural retreat. No doubt the new owner is waiting for the moment of collapse when the walls cave in order to construct a dwelling which requires no restorative work. I wonder whether Moss Green should have been listed, whether I should have taken on that task myself, and if it's not valued as a piece of architectural heritage, what are those emotional qualities it holds that make it feel special enough to want to save? On one visit years ago, when the house was open to elements but some of its contents still present, we noted books on architecture, old journals from the building trade, and piles of photographs. We salvaged a few items, notably one book, New Architecture of London, a selection of buildings since 1930, along with a selection of black and white photographs, some of which I've shown here. Recently, in examining the photographs more closely, I've become fascinated with tracking down the buildings imaged in them. As well as the architectural qualities of the structures, I've had 5 text-based clues to work with. A board in front of one of the blocks of flats with the name Ernest Nifton Limited, a car parked outside another with the registration plate SLX 956, a street reading Westmoreland Terrace, and letters over the entrances to 2 other buildings with the words 1 to 24 Edmund Street and WITL. In working between New Architecture of London, as well as web searches for various clues, I've now managed to track down most of the structures, and it turns out the majority are now what we regard as modernist icons, such as the Elmington Estate in SE5, designed by the LCC from 1957, now largely demolished, Horfield Estate from 52 in Bishopsbridge Road, W2, designed by Tecton Drayton Lasdon for Paddington Council, Alton East from 52 by the LCC, Alton West, again LCC 1955, and Churchill Gardens, designed by Powell and Moyer for Westminster City Council from 1952 to 62. But what of the person who lived in Moss Green and once owned the photographs of these modern buildings? Was he or she an architect, and if so, did they play a role in designing the buildings in the photographs? How did they compare these schemes for urban mass housing with their own rural bungalow? If the delicate beauty of Moss Green points outwards to a whole network of modernist icons, how should one compare these two modernisms, the earlier vernacular craft-based phase of the arts and crafts and the later phase of industrialisation and standardisation? From Tacita Dean's work, critiquing the heroism of modernism by pointing to the failure of certain technological schemes, to Root Blies Luxemburg's glowing photographs of North London's high-rise flats entitled Caliban Towers 1 and 2 from London, a modern project from 1997, which titles modernist architecture as a monster. There's been a recent fascination with the so-called failure of the modern project. In some cases, this takes the form of a wistful melancholy for modernism's passing, and at other times a rather more gleeful delight at the collapse of the social dream that some see as too forceful and others ridiculously idealistic. In 1993, the artist Alison Marchant made a work called Field Study, Charged Atmospheres, where she reproduced photographs dating back to the 70s, thrown away from the National Monuments records, blown up to life size. The decayed photographs showed neglected interiors, high-ceilinged salons from London's Georgian building stock. The work doubled the materiality of decay and the related affects or emotional states associated with neglect or abandonment. The deterioration in charged atmospheres operates at the level of both signified and signifier. Abandoned interiors appear in abandoned photographs. The situation in my image text work is somewhat different. The material decay of the photographs as ink and paper documents is counteracted by the aspiration of the just completed buildings in the images. In these photographs, the buildings are new, they look ahead. It's only the photographs themselves that bear the passage of time. The buildings are well attended to. Indeed, it might be that what holds them together is their place as the centre of attention in a tour of newly completed social housing projects. Witness the group of men in overcoats pointing towards certain features. It's only the photographs themselves that have been left behind to weather the rain on the wheels coming in through the open windows over the years. I titled this image text work, May Morn. Returning to Moss Green once again several weekends ago, much of the timber work had collapsed and was lying in pieces over the grass. I turned one rotten section over to reveal 2 words, painted in fast fragmenting white letters, May Morn. This I remembered was the building's name plaque, which had been located at the entrance to the plot, framed by brambles when we first came across the house. Morn and mourn are homonyms. One suggests a beginning, the other an ending. In grieving, mourning marks the day, while mourning in grieving the loss of something or someone marks an ending. Due to their deteriorating material states, the Moss Green house, the paper of the photographs and the painted letters May Morn all point towards their own disintegration or endings, and yet the buildings contained within the photographs are shown at the beginning of their life. What does it mean now to turn back and examine these icons of modernism at an early moment of springtime, when a hope for a better future was not viewed as a naively misjudged optimism? On a bright spring day, a May morn no less, Days before a general election, I remain hopeful, facing forward. This is not a time for mourning, not a time for grieving the failure of the modernist project. Such a gesture needs to be resisted. The ideals of modernism are to be cherished, not only aesthetically, but also and importantly politically. I think it is precisely because an aspiration for social change remains that we're being presented continuously with an image of modernism as a project that's collapsed. This is the myth-making of capitalist ideology. Writing rather positively of nostalgia as a longing for something better, cultural critic Frederick Jameson has pointed out, with reference to the earlier work of Walter Benjamin on allegory and ruin, that looking back to a past because it appears to be better than the problems of the present is not necessarily regressive, especially if it can be used to change the future. He writes, "But if nostalgia as a political motivation is most frequently associated with fascism, there's no reason why a nostalgia conscious of itself, a lucid and remorseless dissatisfaction with the present on the grounds of some remembered plenitude, cannot furnish as adequate a revolutionary stimulus as any other." So I just want to end by talking about what's happened to this project since last May. So I wrote the first version of this essay a day before the general election of the 6th of May 2010 in the UK, and delivered it as a talk 6 days later, after I'd voted Liberal for the first time in my life. So disgusted was I. You may well laugh, I'm crying. After I had voted Liberal for the first time in my life, so disgusted was I with New Labour's lies over the Iraq War and the transfer of public funds into the hands of banking elites. On a day, the coalition between the Liberals and Tories was formed, and on a day in which I discovered I had helped to deliver the country a condemned government. A bright doctoral student, Justin Hunt, approached me after my talk and asked, "Did you know there are 2 homonyms in the title of your talk, not 1? I looked back blankly. "May the month and May the verb," he explained, and then he added, "You seem to be asking for the right to mourn." It turns out that May is a homograph, not a homonym. May is a month in the year, but it's also a modal verb, one which expresses possibility, a wish, or permission. May I mourn? So post-election and post-New Labour's ambivalence towards the public sphere, the advent of the new government suggests there will be no ambivalence over the public sector. Drastic cuts are to be made. And this is obviously something we're living out now. In such a political climate, this essay and its sense of hope starts to feel rather inappropriate as an emotion for these times. A nostalgia for a modernist housing is turning back to an idealised time in order to seek inspiration for a better future. But now it seems that this turning back takes place not so much with romantic regret, but rather with a deep anger, as I start to watch the slow demolition of the public sector, potentially the end of that modern project of which these housing schemes are a part. So when I was asked to contribute a text work to a new collection called Beyond Utopia, I decided to retitle the work May Morn and give the images some new captions. A spacious 1-bedroom flat situated on the 8th floor, commanding marvellous views of communal gardens and the city beyond. The property is located in Grade 2, listed ex-local authority block with 2 newly installed lifts giving easy access to the shopping, restaurants and transport facilities of Bayswater and Queensway, plus overground routes of Paddington. Magnificent Kensington Gardens are also close by. This property consists of 2 double bedrooms and offers spacious living accommodation. The property is situated on the 3rd floor. The flat would be ideal for a first-time buyer or rental investment. It also benefits from being close to Roehampton University and local amenities. A well-presented, bright 1-bedroom flat on the 6th floor of this Grade 2 listed modern block of flats serviced by 2 lifts. This ex-council flat benefits from spacious rooms and communal gardens. It's offered in good decorative order, benefiting further from being chain-free. A practical 3-bedroom flat split over 2 levels on the upper level of this small block in Churchill Gardens. The property requires updating but gives potential buyers the chance to put their own stamp on the property. An unmodernised 2-bedroom flat set on the 1st floor, lift, of this block on the superbly located Hallfield estate in Bayswater. Occupying approximately 68 square metres, once refurbished, would make an excellent central London home or long-term rental investment. Another great located flat for sale. The property offers a well-proportioned one-bedroom flat located on the 8th floor with great views. Don't worry about the mortgage. Most high street banks will lend due to its excellent location. When I presented this work as part of a lecture at RMIT in early June last year, I was again advised by a smart doctoral student, this time John Hale, to read Owen Hatherley's Militant Modernism. In referencing Richard Parr's amazing photographs of the ruins of the Russian vanguard, Hatherley reminded me of the link between the early Russian constructivist projects of the 20s and the aspirations of British modernism, particularly the post-war social housing schemes by the LCC. It reminded me of my fascination as a student with the notion of the social condenser, which, by overlaying a number of functional programmes, suggested that architectural space might provoke new kinds of social relations. The concept of the social condenser as a transitional architectural space was developed through the theoretical, then practical work of the Russian constructivists in the 20s. The constructivist design methodology was developed in designs for apartments, A to F, for Stroikum, the Russian building committee, realised in 6 schemes, including the Narkomfin communal house in Moscow, designed by Ginsberg with Melinis from 1928 to 9. In Victor Buckley's fascinating in-depth ethnographic study of the Narkomfin, he explains it was a social condenser of the transitional type. This meant that the accommodation allowed for both pre-existing bourgeois living patterns, which were the K and 2F units, and then the fully communist F units, and the difference was that the F units had minimal facilities for preparing food, since this was cooking and eating were to take place in the communal block. Buckley stressed that variety was not an expression of tolerance, but rather reflected the belief that architecture had a transformative power, capable of inducing a particular form of social organisation, and that the intention was that the building would help the transition from bourgeois living patterns into socialist ones. Le Corbusier, whose articles were read by Ginsberg in the 20s, made visits to the Soviet Union to study the architecture. In the slab block of the Unité de Habitation in Marseille, Corb was inspired by many key features of the Narkomfin design. Its rue intérieure, the range of possible apartment types with a double-height living space, communal facilities, and at the same time, references to Corb's 5-point plan, the pilote, free facade, open plan, ribbon windows, roof garden are evident in the Narkomfin. The architectural historian Nicholas Bullock points out how Corb's Unité, which began construction in 1947, was also a reference point for the architects of the LCC of the 50s. While the architects of Alton East were advocates of new humanism, those of Alton West were pro-Corbu. And yet, while Bullock describes the loss of certain design principles vital to the Unité in the process of reformulating the project for London's public housing provision, the difficulty in retaining the communal spaces, double-height living and central access corridor, he fails to focus on the debt that Corb owed to the Narkomfin design. And this results in an argument that vacates the political imperative at the heart of Narkomfin and the public housing projects in France and the UK that its design inspired. In failing to make full reference to the potential of the social condenser in activating social change, I suggest that the link is lost between architecture and revolution. At this moment, on the brink of the collapse of the public sphere, I'm interested in tracing that history of the social condenser as architecture's political unconscious, an aspect in Jameson's terms of the repressed and buried history of class struggle. And I'm keen to search for that transitional space back from London to Marseille to Moscow, and also examine the spaces of its own transition. I'm particularly fascinated by the architectural language used to specify the design and its translation from Russian to French to English, and my intention is to use the language of the original specifications to write a trilingual ode, to take a language usually considered devoid of emotion and produce an emotive piece of prose to be read in situ in the closed-off spaces of London's own social condensers, the empty and now usually locked laundries and other communal spaces of London's post-war housing estates. Thank you.